The late autumn air carried a bite to it, a crisp reminder that winter was just around the corner. Inside the downtown branch of Sterling National Bank, however, the world was climate-controlled and timeless. The air was thick with the quiet hum of commerce, a low thrum of computers, and the soft, rhythmic tapping of keyboards. It was a place of polished surfaces and hushed voices, where money moved not in a rush, but with a steady, predictable current. The floor was a mosaic of dark marble, so highly polished you could see the distorted reflections of the ceiling lights and the people moving across it like solemn ghosts. Through the heavy glass doors, a woman entered. She didn't make a grand entrance. She simply materialized, as if she had always been there. She was in her late 70s, perhaps her early 80s. It was hard to tell. Her hair was a soft, silver white, pulled back from her face in a neat, simple bun that spoke of function over fashion. A few loose strands had escaped to frame a face that was lined with the delicate map of a long life. Her eyes, a clear and placid blue, took in the scene before her, not with curiosity, but with a quiet calm, as if she were merely a visitor to a familiar, yet slightly foreign, land. She wore a faded cardigan, the kind of soft, worn-in wool that has been washed 100 times and comes out feeling like a gentle embrace. Underneath was a simple cream-colored blouse, buttoned to the collar. Her skirt was a practical, dark blue that fell just below her knees, and on her feet were a pair of sensible, low-heeled black shoes that had surely walked many miles. In her hands, she clutched an old leather purse. It wasn't a designer bag. It was a simple, unadorned satchel, the kind of thing one buys for utility and keeps for decades. The leather was creased and softened at the edges. The brass clasp dulled with age and use. Her name was Agnes Gable, to the security guard standing by the door, a man whose uniform was a little too tight and whose expression was a permanent mask of boredom. She was just another elderly customer, likely here to cash a Social Security check or question a small fee. He gave her a brief, polite nod, which she returned with a gentle, almost imperceptible smile. She moved with a slow, deliberate grace, her steps measured and sure. She didn't shuffle like some of the elderly patrons he was used to seeing. She walked. She joined the single line that snaked back from the teller counters. There were only a few people ahead of her. A young man in a suit fidgeting with his phone, a mother trying to quiet a restless toddler, and a man in work boots holding a crumpled pay stub. Agnes stood patiently, her hands resting on the strap of her purse. She didn't look at her phone, for she didn't have one that demanded her constant attention. She didn't scan the room with impatience. She simply stood, observing. She watched the tellers, young men and women in their crisp navy blazers, their fingers dancing across their keyboards. She listened to the low murmur of the conversations, the polite pleasantries that served as the lubricant for financial transactions. There was a rhythm to it all, a professional choreography she understood. Even if she hadn't been a part of it for many years, when it was her turn, she stepped up to the counter. The teller was a young man, no older than 25, with a name tag that read Leo. His hair was neatly combed, and he had a bright, practiced smile that he had perfected during his training. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you today?" he asked, his voice cheerful and impersonal. "Good morning," Agnes replied, her voice soft but clear. She placed her purse on the counter and opened the worn clasp. "I would just like to cash this check, please." Leo nodded, his smile unwavering. "Of course. I'll just need to see your identification, and the check, of course." Agnes reached into her purse and produced her driver's license. It was an old license, the photo on it showing a woman perhaps 20 years younger, but the same clear blue eyes were there. She then pulled out a checkbook. It wasn't a flimsy free one from a bank. It was a heavy, substantial book, bound in a dark green leatherette cover. She opened it and carefully tore out the top check. The paper was thick and cream-colored, with an elegant, understated design. She slid both the license and the check across the cool, smooth granite countertop. Leo took them. He glanced at the ID first, confirming the name Agnes Gable. He then looked down at the check. He saw the name Sterling Holdings Capital, written in a stately serif font at the top left. He saw pay to the order of Agnes Gable. And then his eyes moved to the numbers. His friendly professional smile did not exactly disappear, but it froze on his face, becoming a hollow mask. He blinked once, then twice, thinking the fluorescent lighting above him must be playing a trick on his eyes. He picked up the check, holding it a little closer to his face. The figures were typed, not handwritten. The 8 was followed by 50s, and in front of all those zeros, there was a comma, and before that, another 5 and another 8. The amount was $850,000. His heart gave a sudden, painful lurch against his ribs, like it had been startled. His mouth went dry. A check for that amount was not something a teller like him ever saw. It wasn't something that was just cashed. It was a wire transfer, a manager's call, a mountain of paperwork. This was a different world. This was the kind of money that changed lives, the kind of money that, if handled incorrectly, ended careers. He looked from the check to the woman standing before him. He really looked at her this time, not just seeing an old lady, but seeing the faded cardigan, the simple blouse, the unassuming purse. It didn't make sense. In his mind, people who dealt with sums like this didn't look like this. They wore bespoke suits and carried briefcases. They smelled of expensive perfume and cologne, not of whatever the faint, clean scent was that drifted from this woman. They certainly didn't cash checks like this at a downtown branch on a Tuesday morning. They had private bankers. He could feel a bead of sweat forming on his temple. His training, which had seemed so straightforward a minute ago, was now a jumble of panicked slogans in his head. When in doubt, get a supervisor. Flag all unusual transactions. Report suspicious activity. This was more than unusual. This was unprecedented in his experience. The check looked real. The paper was high quality. The watermark was visible when he tilted it. The signatures looked crisp. But the sheer impossibility of it all was screaming at him. Fraud. The word echoed in his head like a warning bell. Sophisticated fraud, designed to look legitimate. He cleared his throat. The sound loud in the sudden quiet space between them. Ma'am, he began, his voice now tight and strained, losing all of its previous cheerfulness. I'll need a moment with this. Agnes simply watched him, her expression unchanged. There was no surprise, no anxiety on her face. She just nodded slowly. Of course, she said softly. That placid reaction only unsettled Leo more. A normal person, an innocent person, would be asking what was wrong. They would be nervous or confused. Her calm was unnerving. It felt like a performance. I'll be right back, he mumbled, avoiding her eyes. He took the check and her ID and walked away from the counter, his steps feeling clumsy and too loud in his own ears. He could feel the back of his neck getting hot. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew with absolute certainty that this was not a decision he was qualified or paid to make on his own. He walked past the other tellers, past the row of loan officers sitting in their cubicles. His destination a clear and singular point of focus, the manager's office at the back of the bank. The heavy wooden door was closed. A solid barrier between the chaos unfolding in his chest and the authority he desperately needed. Asterisk. The heavy wooden door to the manager's office felt like a portal to another world. Leo, the teller, stood before it for a full 10 seconds, the check feeling like a lit fuse in his trembling hand. He had to knock. He knew he had to knock, but his hand felt heavy, reluctant. What if he was overreacting? What if this was all a huge misunderstanding and he was about to bother the branch manager for nothing? The thought was quickly pushed aside by a much stronger, more terrifying one. What if he wasn't overreacting? What if he let this go, and it turned out to be the biggest fraud the bank had ever seen? His career would be over before it had even begun. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of recycled air conditioning and his own anxiety, and knocked 3 times, his knuckles making a hollow. Formal sound against the dark wood. A voice from inside, sharp and impatient, called out, "Come in." Leo turned the polished brass handle and pushed the door open. The office was exactly as you'd expect. It was a space designed to impress, not to comfort. A large mahogany desk, polished to a deep, dark shine, sat in the center of the room. Behind it was a high-backed leather chair that swiveled slowly around to face him. On the desk, everything was in its place. A neat stack of files, a fancy fountain pen resting in a holder, a computer screen showing a dashboard of figures. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes that had probably never been read, framed certificates, and a single, large photograph of a golf course hung on the wall behind the desk. The man in the chair was Robert Sterling. He was in his late 40s with hair that was just starting to gray at the temples in a way that was, he thought, rather distinguished. He wore a suit that was clearly expensive, tailored perfectly to his frame. His tie was a silk number with a precise, tight knot. He had a face that was accustomed to giving orders and receiving compliance. And he looked at Leo now with an expression that was a mixture of annoyance and dismissal. "Leo," he said. "Not as a greeting, but as a statement of fact. I'm in the middle of reviewing third-quarter projections. This had better be important." Robert Sterling was the branch manager, a title he carried with the weight of a family legacy. His great-grandfather had been a junior partner in the original Sterling National Bank, a fact he liked to bring up in staff meetings, especially when he wanted to remind everyone of the standards he expected. He saw himself not just as a manager of money, but as a guardian of the bank's reputation, a reputation built on the foundations of old money and old-world sensibility. Leo swallowed hard. "Mr. Sterling, I'm sorry to bother you, sir. It's a customer at counter 3. I have a check here, and I'm not sure how to proceed." Robert let out a heavy, theatrical sigh. "Is it a post-dated check? Is the endorsement not matching the name on the face? Use your training, son. We have procedures for this." "Oh, sir, it's not that," Leo said, his voice cracking slightly. He walked to the desk, and with a hand that was still shaking, he placed the check on the polished surface. Robert picked it up. He held it with the tips of his fingers, the same way Leo had, as if it were a piece of forensic evidence. He glanced at the name, Sterling Holdings Capital. A flicker of something, perhaps pride, crossed his face. Before his eyes landed on the amount, the change in him was immediate. The air in the room, which had been merely tense, now felt charged with electricity. His shoulders tightened. His jaw clenched. He put on a pair of reading glasses that had been sitting on his desk and looked at the check again, this time with a deep, searching intensity. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Leo stood there, frozen, feeling like a soldier waiting for a general to pass judgment. Finally, Robert looked up from the check. He took off his glasses and leaned back in his leather chair, which squeaked in protest. He didn't look at Leo. He looked through him as if he were seeing the entire bank, the entire financial system, and the threat it was under. "She brought this to your window?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Yes, sir. She just wanted to cash it." Robert let out a short, sharp laugh that had no humor in it. Cash it, of course. He stood up, the movement smooth and predatory. He straightened his suit jacket, checked his reflection in the glass of a picture on the wall, and walked toward the door. "Leo," he said without turning back, "you did the right thing. Stay here. I will handle this." He swept out of the office, leaving Leo standing in the silent, intimidating room. Feeling a strange mix of relief and dread, Robert walked out into the main banking hall with the measured, confident stride of a man who owned the ground he walked on. He didn't have to look for the woman. His eyes were already fixed on her. She was still standing at counter 3, patiently waiting, just as she had been when he left. She hadn't moved, hadn't fidgeted. She was simply existing in that space, a calm, unremarkable island in a sea of polished marble and anxious energy. As he approached, a few other patrons noticed him. His presence commanded attention. The tellers at their counters straightened up a little, their fingers moving a little faster over their keyboards. The security guard perked up, his posture suddenly rigid. Robert was the king in his castle, and everyone knew it. He stopped a few feet away from Agnes Gable. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't offer a polite greeting. He held the check between 2 fingers, presenting it to her like a piece of garbage he had found on the street. He looked her up and down, a slow, deliberate sweep of his eyes that was meant to be intimidating. He saw the worn cardigan, the sensible shoes, the unadorned purse. He saw an easy target. He saw a stereotype. He saw a person who was in his world completely insignificant. "Ma'am," he began, his tone dripping with a condescension so thick it was almost a physical substance. "We have some serious concerns about this item." Agnes turned her head to look at him. Her blue eyes met his, and for a fleeting moment, Robert felt a flicker of something uncomfortable, like a spark that landed too close to a can of gasoline. But the feeling was gone as quickly as it came. He was the manager. She was the customer with the impossible check. There was no ambiguity here. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice as soft and calm as it had been with the teller. "A problem? I'd say there's a monumental problem," he said, his voice rising slightly. Just enough for the people in line nearby to hear. He wanted them to hear. This was a performance. "Where did you get this check? Who is Sterling Holdings Capital to you? Why would someone like you be in possession of such a large sum?" The phrase, "someone like you," hung in the air, a cloud of pure poison. Agnes's expression didn't change. She didn't seem insulted or angry. She just looked at him as if she were waiting for him to finish his prepared speech. "It's a dividend distribution from a private investment," she said simply. Robert scoffed. The sound was ugly, like metal scraping against pavement. "A dividend distribution? For nearly $1 million? Ma'am, I wasn't born yesterday. Let's be honest with each other. This has all the markings of a sophisticated fraud attempt." He was getting louder now. A few heads in the line had turned. A mother pulled her child a little closer. The young man in the suit was openly staring at them, his phone forgotten in his hand. Robert fed on the attention. It made him feel powerful. He wasn't just a bank manager. He was a guardian, protecting the institution from predators. "Do you have any idea what kind of people run these schemes? They prey on the elderly. They promise you the world, they get you to deposit a fake check like this one, and then they come after your real money. We see it all the time." He was no longer asking questions. He was making accusations, delivering a verdict in the court of public opinion he had just created. "I cannot, in good conscience, honor this check," he declared, pointing a finger at her. "In fact, I have a duty to report this. We have a responsibility to protect our community and our vulnerable customers from scams like this." The word vulnerable landed with a thud. Agnes's face, for the first time, showed a flicker of emotion. It wasn't fear or anger. It was a deep, profound weariness. She had seen this kind of arrogance before in many different forms throughout her long life. It was the arrogance of the powerful who believe their station in life is a direct reflection of their intelligence and worth. It was the blindness of those who measure a person's value by the price of their clothes or the size of their bank account. She took a slow, steadying breath. The air in the bank felt thick and suffocating. She could feel the weight of the stares of the strangers around her. She felt the heat of shame rise in her chest. It's not because she had done anything wrong, but because of the public, humiliating way she was being treated. To be accused of being foolish, of being a victim, of being a criminal, in front of all these people was a cruel kind of punishment. She had lived her life with a quiet dignity, and this man was trying to strip it away from her with his loud, booming voice. "Sterling," she said. Her voice still soft, but now it had a new quality to it. It was firm. It was solid. It cut through his noise like a knife through silk. "You are making a grievous error." He threw his head back and laughed, a cruel barking sound. "An error? The only error here was yours, thinking you could walk into my bank and get away with this. I'm not going to call the police just yet. I'm going to give you the opportunity to leave quietly. Take your things and go. Consider this your one and only warning." He turned his back on her, a final dismissive gesture. "Kevin," he said to the teller at the next window, "I need you to call security. We have a situation here." Agnes stood there, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She watched the arrogant, foolish man issue his orders. She saw the fear in the young teller's eyes. She saw the curious, judgmental looks from the people in line. And in that moment, she knew that quiet dignity wasn't enough. It wasn't enough to simply be right. Sometimes the only way to fight arrogance is with power. and she had more power than this man could ever possibly imagine. Without another word to the manager, she reached into her old purse. The air in the bank was thick and heavy, like the atmosphere just before a thunderstorm. Every eye seemed to be fixed on the drama unfolding at the teller counter. The manager, Robert, stood with his back to Agnes, his posture radiating a smug, self-righteous confidence. He had already decided the outcome of this encounter. He was the hero of his own story, the wise and vigilant protector of the bank's integrity, unmasking a criminal in plain sight. He had given his order to call security, and he was now savoring the moment, the feeling of being in complete control. He expected to hear her shuffle away in shame, perhaps a tearful plea for mercy. That is what his script called for. But Agnes Gable did not follow his script. While Robert was preening in his perceived victory, Agnes's hands moved with a calm, unhurried purpose inside her worn leather purse. They did not fumble or search. They knew exactly where they were going. Her purse was not a black hole of lost items like so many others. It was a testament to order and function. Tucked away in a small zippered compartment was a simple, old-fashioned flip phone. It wasn't a smartphone. It didn't have a touch screen or access to 1,000 apps. It had a small screen, a physical keypad, and a battery that could hold a charge for a week. It was a tool, not a toy. It was a phone for making calls, and that was all she ever needed it for. She pulled it out and closed the flap of her purse. The sight of the dated, clunky device seemed to amuse Robert. He glanced over his shoulder, a sneer touching his lips. "What are you going to do? Call your grandson to come and get you. It's a little late for that." Agnes didn't respond to his taunt. Her focus was absolute. She ignored him completely, a form of dismissal that was far more powerful than any argument she could make. She opened the phone, and her fingers, though wrinkled and marked with the faint brown spots of age, moved with a surety that belied their appearance. She didn't have to look up a number. She didn't have to search her contacts. She pressed a sequence of buttons from pure muscle memory, a number she had known for decades. The phone emitted a series of soft, electronic beeps, a sound that was almost comically old-fashioned in the silent, tense bank. She put the phone to her ear. The bank was so quiet now, you could almost hear the faint, distant ring at the other end of the line. It rang once. A sharp, professional voice answered immediately. There was no corporate greeting, no menu of options. Just a direct "Mrs. Gable. A pleasure to hear from you. How may the holding company be of service today?" The voice was Mark's. It wasn't the CEO, not exactly. That title was for the public face of the company. Mark was more like the chief troubleshooter, the executor of the Gable family's will. He had worked for Agnes's late husband for 20 years before being entrusted with the full management of their affairs. He knew who she was, not just as a name on a portfolio, but as the woman who signed his paychecks and, more importantly, the woman who deserved his absolute and unwavering respect. Agnes did not raise her voice. Her tone was as placid as a still pond. "Mark, it seems I'm having a bit of trouble at one of your branches." The downtown location. There was a barely perceptible pause on the other end. "The downtown branch? Mrs. Gable, that should be one of our premier locations. What seems to be the problem?" His voice was calm, but underneath it, Agnes could hear the shift, the immediate alertness. "The manager, a Mr. Sterling," she said clearly and evenly, "has just accused me of fraud. He is refusing to honor a dividend check and has threatened to call security to have me removed." The silence on the other end of the line this time was heavy and absolute. It lasted for perhaps 5 seconds, but in the bank, it felt like an eternity. When Mark spoke again, his voice had changed. The polished, polite professionalism was gone, replaced by something cold, hard, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of a man who was about to extinguish a problem with extreme prejudice. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "please stay right where you are. Put the phone on speaker if you wish, but do not move. I will handle this immediately." And with that, the line went dead. While this quiet, devastating conversation was taking place, Robert's smugness had been curdling into outright impatience and then open mockery. He watched her with her little old phone, his sneer growing wider. He was enjoying this. This was better than he had imagined. It was pathetic. He turned to the other tellers and to the growing crowd of onlookers. "You see?" he said, his voice booming through the bank again. "This is what we're up against. They're not just desperate, they're delusional. They really think these little games work." He pointed at Agnes, who now stood holding a silent phone to her ear, looking like a small, serene statue in the middle of a hurricane. "She's probably talking to one of her accomplices right now. Probably some guy in a call center halfway around the world who told her to do this." A few people in the crowd murmured. Some looked sympathetic toward Agnes. Others seemed to agree with the manager. The young man in the suit looked intrigued, a predator sensing a new and interesting situation. Robert had the crowd. He had the power. He decided to press his advantage. "Security," he bellowed, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "I told you to call security." Just as the words left his mouth, a new sound began to cut through the tense atmosphere. It was a sharp, insistent ringing coming from his office. It wasn't his main line. It was the private line, the red phone that connected directly to the corporate headquarters of Sterling Holdings Capital. It was a phone that never rang unless something was on fire. The shrill, piercing sound made Robert jump. It was an alarm bell of a different kind, and it struck him with a jolt of pure adrenaline. For a moment, he looked confused. Who could that be? He had no meeting scheduled that would warrant that call. He looked from the sound of the ringing phone back to the old woman. A strange, cold feeling began to creep up his spine. There was no connection, he told himself. It couldn't be. But then he saw her eyes. She had finally lowered the phone from her ear. Her calm blue eyes were fixed on him, and in them he saw no fear, no anger, no pleading. He saw something that looked chillingly like pity. He had to answer that phone. He knew it with a certainty that scared him. He broke his gaze with her and practically ran the few steps to his office, his polished shoes squeaking on the marble floor. He burst through the door and snatched the receiver from its cradle, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Sterling here," he said, his voice tight and breathless. The voice that came through the receiver was not the calm, professional voice he was used to dealing with from corporate. It was a low, controlled growl of pure fury. "It was Mark, Robert," he said. He didn't call him Mr. Sterling, just used his first name, a stripping away of all formal deference. "Mark? What is it?" "I'm in the middle of a situation out here. You're going to shut your mouth and listen to me." Robert, the voice cut him off, each word precise and sharp as a shard of glass. "Are you standing in the banking hall right now?" Robert was taken aback by the aggression in the tone. "Yes, I am. There's a woman here, a fraudster. She's trying to cachet. Her name is Agnes Gable," the voice on the phone said. And the way he said her name, with a reverence and a gravity that made Robert's blood run cold, told him everything he needed to know. "Do you want to guess who Sterling Holdings Capital is named after, Robert?" The question hung in the air, a rhetorical guillotine. Robert's mind raced, trying to connect the dots, but they were moving too fast. "I'll tell you," the voice continued, relentless. "It was originally named after the founder of the capital arm, a brilliant man named Thomas Sterling. And who do you think provided the seed money for Thomas Sterling to get started? Who do you think was his original angel investor, the person whose family has been the single largest individual shareholder in this company for the last 60 years? Robert couldn't speak. A cold dread was flooding his veins, paralyzing him. He looked out through the glass wall of his office, at the small, unassuming woman standing by the counter. The world tilted on its axis. "It's the Gable family, you imbecile." The CEO's voice roared, the control finally snapping. "And that woman out there, that fraudster you're about to have thrown out of my bank, is Agnes Gable. She is the matriarch of the family that owns a controlling interest in the company that owns your job. That check you are holding is not only legitimate, it is a tiny, insignificant fraction of the money she has invested with us. The interest on that check is probably more than your annual salary." The silence in the office was now a physical thing, a crushing weight. Robert felt his legs go weak. He had to grab the edge of his desk to stay upright. The smugness, the arrogance, the feeling of power, it all evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a hollow, ringing void of pure terror. The check you hold is not fraudulent, Robert, the voice said, the quietness now more terrifying than the shouting. Your judgment, however, is a catastrophe. You will not only honor that check, you will personally escort it to her. You will not only apologize, you will do so in a manner that is both profuse and humiliating. You will offer her any and every service this bank can provide. You will treat her like visiting royalty. You will do this, Robert, because your employment now depends entirely and completely on the satisfaction of Agnes Gable. Is that understood? Robert could only manage a choked, strangled sound in response. Out. Is that understood? The voice repeated a final, lethal snap. Yes, Robert finally whispered, the word barely audible. Yes, understood. Good. Go fix it. The line went dead. Robert stood there for a moment, the dead receiver still in his hand. He looked out at Agnes Gable, who was now putting her simple, old-fashioned phone back into her simple, old-fashioned purse. She had done all of this with a few quiet words. He, with all his noise and power, hadn't stood a chance. The humiliation washed over him in a hot, nauseating wave. He had not just made a mistake. He had committed an act of professional suicide. His career, the one he had been so proud of, was over. All because he had judged a book by its cover, and had been too arrogant to read the title page. Asterisk, the receiver in Robert's hand felt like it was made of lead, heavy and cold. The voice of the CEO, Mark, still echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence of his office. Your employment now depends entirely and completely on the satisfaction of Agnes Gable. The words weren't just a threat. They were a death sentence for his career. Slowly, mechanically, he placed the receiver back in its cradle. The loud click it made was the sound of a door slamming shut on his future. He stood there, frozen, for a full minute. The world outside his glass wall seemed to be moving in slow motion. He saw the other customers, the tellers, the security guard, all living in a world that no longer included him. His eyes were locked on the source of his undoing, the small, silver-haired woman standing patiently by the counter. She hadn't moved. She hadn't gloated. She hadn't even looked in his direction. She was simply waiting, as if she knew what was coming, as if it were an inevitable, natural consequence, like rain following dark clouds. The transformation that began inside Robert was not voluntary. It was a primal, instinctual reaction to the threat of extinction. The arrogance that had held him up like scaffolding for his entire adult life simply collapsed. The pillars of his confidence, his title, his suit, his family name turned to dust. All that was left was a hollow, terrified shell of a man. He looked at his reflection in the dark screen of his computer monitor and saw a stranger. His face was pale, his eyes wide with a panic he couldn't conceal. He had to go out there. There was no other choice. He took a step, and his legs felt like they were made of jelly. He had to hold on to the edge of his desk to keep his balance. The short walk from his office door to the teller counter, a distance he had covered 1,000 times with an air of ownership, now felt like a mile-long gauntlet of shame. Every pair of eyes in the banking hall was on him. He could feel their gazes like physical blows. The security guard, the tellers, the people in line, they had all witnessed his tirade. They had all seen him at his most powerful, his most arrogant. Now they were about to see him at his most pathetic. He moved forward. His gait no longer a confident stride, but a shuffling, uncertain gait. His expensive suit, which had felt like armor moments before, now felt like a costume he was wearing in a play he no longer understood. His shoulders were slumped, his head bowed. He was no longer the king in his castle. He was a prisoner being led to his own execution. He reached the counter, stopping a few feet from Agnes Gable. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He tried again, and what emerged was a dry, rasping croak that didn't sound like his own voice. Mrs. ... Mrs. Gable. She turned to face him. Her expression was exactly as it had been all along, calm, unreadable. She did not look at him with triumph or anger. She looked at him with a kind of neutral, almost clinical curiosity, as if he were an interesting but slightly unpleasant specimen under a microscope. This was, in its own way, more humiliating than if she had screamed at him. Her indifference was the ultimate judgment. Mrs. Gable, he tried again, his voice shaking uncontrollably. I am so. So incredibly sorry. The words felt inadequate, pathetic. He was stumbling in the dark, trying to find the right phrase, the magic words that could undo what he had done, but he knew there were none. The apology that came out of him was a frantic, disjointed torrent of words. It wasn't a speech. It was a confession. He babbled about his mistake, his terrible error in judgment, his overwhelming concern for the bank's security. He talked about the pressure, the responsibility, making excuses even as he was trying to apologize. A testament to how deeply ingrained his arrogance truly was. Agnes listened to his frantic groveling without interrupting. She let him run out of steam, let him exhaust himself in a puddle of his own self-pity. The other customers watched, mesmerized. The young man in the suit had a small, satisfied smirk on his face. The mother held her child's hand, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock and pity for the old woman. The tellers were staring, their mouths slightly agape. This was a moment they would tell stories about for years. Finally, Robert was reduced to just standing there gasping for breath, his face slick with sweat. Agnes spoke. Her voice was still soft, but it cut through his sputtering apologies with surgical precision. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her tone devoid of any emotion, "please just cash the check." The simplicity of her request was a slap in the face. She didn't want his excuses. She didn't want his performance. She wanted the service she had come for in the first place. All his drama, all his power and terror was irrelevant to her. Yes. He stammered. "Yes, of course." Right away, he turned to Leo, the young teller who had started this whole disaster. "Leo," he said, his voice a pathetic whine, "you will personally process this transaction. You will go to the vault. You will get a cashier's check for the full amount, or you will get cash if that is what she wishes. Do you understand me? Do it now." Leo looked from his terrified manager to the serene old woman and back again, his own face a mask of confusion and awe. He just nodded and scrambled away, disappearing into the back office to retrieve the funds. Robert turned back to Agnes. His hands clasped together in a gesture of supplication. "Mrs. Gable, please, while we wait, can I get you some coffee? Some water? Please come into my office. We can make you comfortable." He was desperate now, offering her the very space where he had just been so thoroughly emasculated. It was a pathetic attempt to regain some semblance of control, to frame her as his honored guest. Agnes simply shook her head. "That won't be necessary, Mr. Sterling." Her refusal was another small, precise cut. She was not here to make him feel better. She was here to get her check. Leo returned a moment later, looking like he was carrying a holy relic. In his hands was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was heavy with cash. He had brought it in stacks, all crisp, new $100 bills, secured with paper bands. He had to use both hands to hold it. He placed it on the counter in front of Robert. Robert's hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. It was the physical embodiment of his failure. He looked at Agnes, his eyes pleading. "Mrs. Gable, I am begging for your forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I was a fool. I was an arrogant fool." Agnes reached out and took the envelope from him. Her fingers brushed his, and he flinched as if he had been burned. She didn't look inside. She simply opened her old purse and slid the heavy envelope into its deep, empty main compartment. The weight of it made the bag sag a little. She looked at him then, really looked at him for the first time since he had returned from his office. Her blue eyes, which had seemed so placid before, now held a deep, ancient wisdom. It was as if she were looking not just at him, but through him, at the generations of men like him who had built their worlds on the shaky foundation of judging others. "Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but carrying an immense weight. "Prejudice is a lazy and dangerous shortcut of the mind." She paused, letting the words sink in. Robert just stared at her, his mouth slightly open, mesmerized by the profound simplicity of her statement. "It costs far more than you think," she finished. With that, she turned away from him. She gave a small, polite nod to Leo, the young teller, who had started it all. Then she began to walk toward the exit. She did not hurry. She did not look back. Her walk was the same as when she had arrived, slow, measured, and dignified. The heavy envelope of cash in her purse did not seem to change her posture or her pace. The crowd of onlookers parted for her as if she were royalty, a silent, respectful aisle forming in her wake. They watched her not with pity, but with a kind of awe. Robert stood frozen at the counter, watching her retreating back. He watched her push open the heavy glass door and step out into the bright autumn sunlight. The door swung shut behind her, and she was gone. The moment she disappeared, the spell was broken. The bank seemed to come back to life, the low hum of the computers returning, the shuffling of feet in the line resuming. But for Robert, the world was now silent and still. He was left standing there, a broken man, the ghost of his former self. He could still feel the weight of the envelope in his memory. He could still hear her words in his ears. "It costs far more than you think." He finally understood. His job was gone, his reputation was in tatters, and his entire identity, she had built so carefully, had been proven to be a fragile, hollow thing. He had been so focused on protecting the bank's money from a supposed fraudster that he had failed to see the real, immeasurable value standing right in front of him. He had lost everything not because of a mistake, but because of a mindset. And as he stood there, alone in his shame, he knew that was a loss from which he would never, ever recover. The heavy glass door of the bank swung shut, and the world outside was a world away. The muffled sound of city traffic, the distant wail of a siren, the crisp scent of autumn air, it all felt separate from the sealed, silent tomb of the banking hall. Inside, the air was still thick with the residue of what had just happened. It was a strange electric stillness, a moment held in suspension. Every person in that room, from the highest-ranking manager to the newest customer, was processing the event in their own way. Robert Sterling was a statue. He stood by the teller counter, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his gaze fixed on the space where Agnes Gable had just been. He was no longer seeing the polished marble or the line of customers. He was seeing the replay of his own arrogance, hearing his own booming, his foolish voice echoing in the empty chambers of his mind. The finality of it was crushing. His career wasn't just on thin ice. It had already fallen through and was drowning in the frozen water below. There was no coming back from this. The CEO had been explicit. His fate was sealed. The spell was broken by a young teller clearing her throat. It was a small, nervous sound, but it was enough to make the world start turning again. The people in the line began to shuffle their feet, their eyes darting away from Robert as if looking at him too long might curse them. The murmur of quiet conversation started to rise, a low buzz of speculation and gossip. The mother with the child gave Robert a final look of pity before turning her attention back to her little one. Leo, the teller who had first encountered Agnes, stood motionless for another moment, his mind racing. He felt a strange mix of terror and relief. He had been spared the full force of the CEO's wrath, but he knew his life had just changed as well. He had witnessed his manager, the unflappable Robert Sterling, crumble into a heap of apologies. It was a lesson in power, in perception, and in humility that he would never forget. Slowly, as if in a trance, Robert turned and walked back toward his office. He didn't swagger. He didn't walk. He drifted. Each step was a monumental effort. He felt the eyes of his employees on him, but for the first time, he didn't feel their respect or their fear. He felt their judgment. It was a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. Making him stoop, he entered his office and closed the door behind him. The room, which had always felt like a sanctuary of authority, now felt like a prison cell. The leather chair behind his desk didn't look comfortable. It looked lonely. The books on the shelves didn't look like symbols of knowledge. They looked like props. He sat down, not in the chair, but in the small, stiff visitor's chair in the corner of the room. He didn't feel he deserved to sit in the manager's chair. He wasn't the manager anymore. He was just a man waiting for the end. He looked out the window, but he wasn't really seeing the street below. He was seeing his life flash before his eyes. He saw himself as a young man, hungry and ambitious, climbing the corporate ladder. He remembered the pride he felt when he was promoted to branch manager, the feeling of finally arriving. He had always believed in order, in rules, and systems. and he had believed, deep down, that his position was a result of his superior judgment. He was the one who could spot the frauds, the liars, the cheats. He was the gatekeeper. The irony of it all was so bitter, it tasted like poison. He had been so focused on guarding the gate from the perceived threats that he had locked out the owner of the entire kingdom outside the office. The banking hall was trying to return to normalcy, but it was a different kind of normal. Leo had resumed his post at the counter, but he was different. When the next customer stepped up, he didn't offer a polished, practiced smile. He offered a genuine, slightly weary smile. He looked at the person in front of him, not as a transaction to be processed, but as a human being with a story he couldn't possibly know. He helped an elderly man sort through a confusing stack of bills, taking his time, explaining things clearly and patiently. He treated a young student opening her first account with the respect he would give a CEO. The lesson he had learned was a heavy one, but it had made him better at his job in a way no training manual ever could. The other tellers and employees were whispering amongst themselves. The story was spreading through the bank like wildfire. Each retelling added a new detail, a new layer of drama. But the core of it remained the same. The big, important manager had been put in his place by a quiet old woman. It was a story that would be passed down from one generation of employees to the next. A cautionary tale told on quiet afternoons and during coffee breaks. It was the legend of Agnes Gable. Meanwhile, Agnes walked the 3 blocks from the bank to a small, unassuming park. The sun was warm on her face, a pleasant contrast to the chilled atmosphere of the bank. She found an empty bench near a small fountain and sat down. The heavy purse sat beside her. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The check wasn't the point. It had never been the point. She watched a group of children playing on the grass, their laughter like small bright bells in the air. She watched a young couple sharing a book on another bench, their heads close together. She watched an old man patiently teaching his dog to stay. These were the things that mattered. These were the moments that made up a life. Not the balances in an account or the titles on a business card. Her late husband, a man of immense wealth himself, had always taught her that money was a tool, nothing more. It was a hammer, not the house. It could be used to build things or to break things, but the hammer itself had no value. The value was in the craft of the person wielding it. Mr. Sterling, she thought with a sigh, had tried to use the hammer as a weapon, and in doing so, had only smashed his own fingers. After a while, she pulled her simple flip phone from her purse again. She dialed Mark's number. He answered on the first ring. "Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice now back to its calm, professional tone. "Are you all right? Did he give you any trouble?" "No trouble at all, Mark," she said, a genuine warmth in her voice. "He was very cooperative. Thank you for your assistance. It was my pleasure, I assure you," Mark said. "And for what it's worth, I am deeply sorry for the way you were treated. Robert Sterling has been relieved of his duties effective immediately. A formal notice will go out to the staff this afternoon." Agnes was quiet for a moment. She didn't feel a sense of victory. She didn't feel satisfaction. She felt a quiet sadness. "That is unfortunate for him, Mark. With all due respect, Mrs. Gable, his conduct was inexcusable." She agreed. "It was also foolish. And there is a difference. He was not a bad man, Mark. He was just a man who believed his own press. That is a dangerous form of blindness." There was a pause on the other end. "I understand," Mark said, though perhaps he didn't. Not fully. "Was there anything else you needed?" "There is one thing," Agnes said. "The young teller. The one who first helped me. His name was Leo. It's Leo Thornton. He's been with us for about 2 years. A good employee. He was kind and professional," Agnes said. "He was also the only one who had the sense to know he was out of his depth and to call for help. That is a valuable quality. See to it that he is recognized for it. Not in a big public way. That would embarrass him. Just ... Make sure his manager knows he did a good job today. I'll make sure of it, Mrs. Gable." "Thank you, Mark," she said softly. "That's all." She hung up the phone and placed it back in her purse. She sat there for a long time, just watching the world go by. The weight of the day's events slowly lifting from her shoulders. Back at the bank, the end of the day came. The lights in the banking hall were dimmed. The employees packed up their things and left, their usual chatter replaced with a more subdued, thoughtful energy. Leo was one of the last to leave. As he walked past the manager's office, he saw Robert Sterling sitting in the visitor's chair, staring out the window. The desk light was off. The man was just a silhouette against the fading light of the city. He didn't move. He didn't seem to notice Leo was there. Leo paused for a moment. He felt a pang of something, not quite pity, but close to it. He thought about what Agnes Gable had said. Prejudice is a lazy and dangerous shortcut of the mind. It costs far more than you think. He looked at the silhouette of the broken manager, and then he thought of the quiet, dignified woman who had walked out of the bank with more grace and power than anyone in the room could comprehend. It was a lesson about more than just banking. It was a lesson about life. Leo turned and walked out of the bank, leaving Robert Sterling to his silence. As he stepped out onto the sidewalk and into the cool evening air, he felt a newfound sense of purpose in his own small, simple job. He didn't know what the future held for him, or for the bank. But he knew one thing for sure. He would never ever look at a person and think he knew their story just by looking at their clothes, or their shoes, or the check in their hand. He would just see a person, and he would treat them with respect. It was a simple lesson, but as he had learned today, it was the one that was worth the most.